Welcome in, everyone. You are listening to the Authority Podcast here on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Excited to share a conversation with you. Today, we're actually talking not only about one book, but two. My guest, Brian Butler, has a couple of recent books out that'll both tie into this conversation, and they're really all about giving every student the education they deserve, a gifted education, a limitless future. And we're going to get into both of those. But to tell you a little bit about Brian, he is an educational consultant, speaker, author, and award-winning former principal who's passionate about nurturing collaborative school cultures that unlock every student's unlimited potential. As a former school-based educator and principal, Brian worked with countless parents and parent groups, supporting and guiding them in their essential role in nurturing their children's growth and potential. He emphasized the importance of leveraging the unique strengths and insights that each family contributed. Brian is the co-author of What About Us, the PLC at Work process for grades pre-K to 2 teams. And he is the author of the two books we're talking about today. Every Student Deserves a Gifted Education, 5 Shifts to Nurture Each Student's Unique Strengths, Passions, and Talents, and Limitless Future, an action guide to nurturing your child's unique strengths, passions, and talents. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ross. I appreciate you having me on.
Let's start with a little more about you. Can you share a bit more about your personal story, your professional journey, what journey you took to become an educator, right? What led you to that point, and then how that brought you to what you're doing today?
Sure. It's interesting because my story, I was born in 1965. So I just told everybody my age. I just turned 60 a couple of weeks ago. But my story did not start in 1965. My story started in the 1940s. My dad was in high school in the 1940s, and his parents, my grandparents, were sharecroppers. My grandfather had a third grade education, and my grandmother had a fifth grade education. And back in those times, you just be think about it, in the 1940s, my grandfather was born in the 1800s. And so they were in this cycle of poverty. They were sharecroppers. My great great grandparents were enslaved Africans. And so this cycle of poverty just repeated itself generation after generation. So in the 1940s, when my dad was in high school, he said to my grandparents, his parents, Mom and Dad, I want to go to college. He would have been the first person in his family to go to college. It wasn't even really thought of in general for African Americans back then to go to college. I mean, some people did, but not where they were from. And they were all for it, Ross. They were like, this is a way to break the cycle of poverty. There's only one problem. They were sharecroppers. So they didn't own the land. They didn't own the house they lived in. There was a owner of the land, owner of the house. They lived in a one-room house with an outhouse. He had number of brothers and sisters. And so they were very excited. And so when the sharecropper, the owner of the land, came to the house, they told him, they were pretty naive. They said, Paul's going to go to college. He's going to be the first in the family to go to college. And the owner of the land said this, and they were shocked. He said, if Paul goes to college, then I'm going to kick you off the land and you're going to lose your right to sharecrop this land. And he closes the door and just leaves. And this was my dad's senior year in high school. I mean, he just decided that he wanted to go. And they had to make a decision because they weren't getting paid very much. The sharecropper back then, or the owner of the land, got like 85 to 90% of their profits. And so they only got to keep like 10% of their profits, and they got to live in the house. And so they turned to my father and said, "You got to go. Whatever happens, you got to go." They were actually brilliant because they had this foresight that they knew that education was freedom. They couldn't continue the cycle of poverty, and they didn't want my father to continue the life that they had. And so my dad goes to college. And I'm going to make a long story short, but he goes to Bowie State College, which is a historical Black university. Back then, my family was from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So he went to Bowie State College. It's Bowie University, I think now. And that first year, they didn't have any phones. So halfway through the year, my dad was coming home on a break. He hadn't spoken to his family because he didn't have any phones back then, or they were too poor to have phones. So he got back to the farm where they lived. What do you think happened? What do you think happened?
Nobody was there.
Bingo, they were gone. The owner of the land made good on that promise that he was going to kick them off the land because education was freedom. It was access,
Yeah.
opportunity. So my dad actually goes on and finishes college. He becomes a reading teacher. He eventually becomes a principal, but he becomes a reading teacher, and he does well. He becomes a principal. Then he goes back into the classroom. But he has a family. He has my brother and my sister who are older, and then me. And my brother and sister and were outstanding students. My mom, I have to say, went to college. She went to Maryland State College, which is University of Maryland Eastern Shore now. And so my brother and sister, as I said, they were outstanding students. And then came me. I struggled literally mightily to learn how to read in kindergarten and in first grade. And early on, the teacher in my primary years had suggested or recommended that I be retained. And my parents said, no, we got this because I struggled to learn how to read fluently. I didn't like reading, it was a struggle for me. But I was fortunate. And this is where my passion comes from. I literally was fortunate because what did I say my dad was? What was my dad? A reading teacher. I was literally born in the right family because I had an interventionist at home. If I was born in a different family, I have no idea where I would be today. My trajectory would have been totally different, but I was able to catch up. My dad and mom read to me at home. They gave us a lot of background knowledge. We went on trips. And so I was able to just catch on. And I did fine eventually. I was never, in quote, a great student, but I was able to be solid. And they modeled a lot of the behaviors that allowed me to be successful, like being persistent and self-control and discipline and curiosity. And so those things that are in one of my books that I talk about, those are some of the behaviors that helped me be successful, not just as a student, but as an athlete as well. And so I went to GW. I was able to get a basketball scholarship. I was, pretty good in basketball. I got my undergrad degree in communications. I did not want to be an educator. That's not
Mhm.
what I wanted to be. I went overseas and played in Europe for a year, came back and was looking for a job in radio and television. And I decided that I did not want to move to a small market to kind of work my way up. So I started to substitute teach. And I kind of fell in love with it. I had said I would never be an educator because my dad was an educator. And I was like, I want to do something totally different.
Yeah.
Oh, but I loved it. A principal, excuse me, said, you seem like you're really good at this and you're interested, you're passionate. And she said, why don't you go back to school? And so I went back to school, got my degree in phys ed. Then I got another degree, a master's degree in counseling. Finally got a degree or certification in administration. Kind of the rest is history. I've spent 36 years in education. I've had an amazing career. There have been challenges, but there are so many people who have helped me along the way. And so my passion is every kid has a talent, every kid has a strength, every kid has a gift. We just have to give them the opportunities, give them the access to find their talents, their passions, their strengths in order for them to fly. And so, again, because of my grandparents, they knew that this was an opportunity and they were going to take a huge hit by losing their opportunity to sharecrop, but they knew that this was freedom for my dad. And so I retired as a principal in 2017. I've been consulting for since 2005, but I really been consulting for full time since 2017. I've written my latest two books, out of this idea that, and what I've experienced as a principal, that every kid can be successful. And do I say every kid is gifted in everything? No. We have to help them find their passions. Like some kids are passionate about science, some kids are passionate about carpentry, some kids are passionate
Mhm.
about math or art or whatever, but we have to help them and nurture that in them. And so when I hear people say that kid can't, it's not the kid, it's the adult.
Mhm.
I mean, that's something lacking in the adults that say that that kid can't, because all kids can if we give them the opportunity and the support to be able to find their strengths and do what we think that they can do. So that's
Yeah.
where I am today. I know it's a kind of a long-winded, kind of winding road to where we're going, but I think it's really important for people to understand why I'm so passionate about every kid. It doesn't matter who your background or where you're from. I think we as the adults have the collective knowledge, skills, wisdom, education, and I said collective. I don't want to put this on the backs of one single teacher. If we have a group of people in a school with all these degrees, then we should be able to figure it out for each kid. And my question is, what would you do for your own kid? And if you would do that for your own kid, then you should be willing to do that for anybody's kid because they are our kids when they come into those schools.
Yeah. And you're making me think of a lot of things, and yeah, I'm afraid that it's going to lead to a very long and potentially either connected or disconnected string of thoughts, but related to the importance of the story you just told and the context of who the story is about, right?
Yeah.
You, your father, your grandparents, not hundreds of years ago. Like this was now, like the history, how close it is. And I think like a lot of times we have these conversations and we're going to talk about how to make education effective for every student, that we get to these points as history progresses where we just like kind of lose the appreciation for what it took to get to that point and start
Sure.
to maybe lose our perspective on it. I've seen it in some of the trends systemically in education in recent years, these kind of trends that I guess indicate like a lack of appreciation for the miracle that is universal public schooling
Yeah.
and the fact that it exists and that every kid can go, right? And whether that's related to, I mean, some of the more extreme views about we shouldn't have public schools to vouchers and all that kind of stuff. But I think they all, like, a lot of it just what it lacks is the how, like what that means and how that is the like the foundational public good that enables a society to become what it is. And it's not unique to that. I think it relates to a lot of other things that as we get a certain number of years beyond, say, World War II, right? And the people who were involved in it are no longer here. And it's like, yeah, but that was not that long ago, right? Like and it's like that was it's not something in the distant past. There's the very real things.
Yeah, in schooling, I mean, to be honest, it's really for our history, it's the one thing that can tie people together and that actually is the vehicle for people to have upward mobility, education, right? And so if we can see that for like I said, for our own kids, then we have to see that for other kids. And we have to have this passion and this drive to do whatever we can to ensure that they have the opportunities. I mean, there's huge opportunity gaps for our kids. And so, like I said, I was really like in my book, Every Student Deserves a Gifted Education. In the first chapter, I talk or the introduction, I talked about this that idea with what I just said, born in the right family. Because if I was born in a different family, I have no idea where my trajectory would have been. And it shouldn't take for a kid to quote be born in the right family to have the opportunities that I had. That's just the luck of the draw, you know.
Yeah,
Can I read something to you really quick from my
sure.
book?
Mhm.
It's from Every Student Deserves a Gifted Education, and I kind of start off this first part with this quote. The lesson here is very simple, but it's striking how often it's overlooked. We are so caught up in the myths of the best and the brightest and the self-made that we think outliers spring naturally from the earth. We look at the young Bill Gates and marvel that our world allowed that 13-year-old to become a fabulously successful entrepreneur. But that's the wrong lesson. Our world only allowed one 13-year-old unlimited access to a time-sharing terminal in 1968. What if a million teenagers had been given the same opportunity? How many more Microsofts would we have today? To build a better world, we need to replace the patchwork of lucky breaks, arbitrary advantages that determine success, fortunate birth dates, that's me, born in the right family, and happy accidents of history with a society that provides opportunities for all. That's from Malcolm Gladwell. And so again, it's like the opportunity gap. And sometimes it kind of burns me up because somebody will say, my kid is so, gifted or my kid is so smart. And I'm saying all kids, if they have the opportunities, they're going to find their passion and find their path just like your kid does. Your kid just has more opportunities, just like my own daughters have had abundance of opportunities. But everybody doesn't have those. And so how can we in schools provide these opportunities? We can't do everything, but we can provide opportunities to hopefully spark something in kids that they are willing to work hard at it and say, oh, this is something, a path that I want to take, or something that I want to try. I might try it, I don't like it, and then I may try another, have another opportunity. But we have to give multiple opportunities for kids so they can kind of find what's going to light their fire. But again, Malcolm Gladwell is somebody that I really admire, and he hit it spot on. It's not about somebody who's just quote gifted or just like this star. It's just this person had an opportunity. His parents were wealthy. His parents had an opportunity to help him work on a computer or a time sharing terminal. But like Malcolm Gladwell said, what if a million kids had that opportunity? What would our world be today?
Yeah, no, it's very true, and it's important to dig into to that, right? And say what is what are those environmental factors that facilitate that success, and how do we create them intentionally for more kids, for every kid, and not take the lesson that yes, everybody has different strengths, interests, right? Different things that they eventually might do, but that's different from saying that there's only some people who are capable, and usually, and especially in the realm of mega success, mega wealth, like you can usually draw a line to a lot of opportunities that led to that. It doesn't just happen.
Yeah. And again, when I talk about every student deserves a gifted education, what I am saying is I'm starting with the premise that all kids have gifts. And so
Mhm.
I'm not saying I'm doing away with, and again, we're not going to be able to do away with it, but our current system has kids being tested or creating a portfolio in elementary school at first grade and second grade. And then that portfolio or that test is evaluated to see if you're put in the gifted program. I'm saying I'm not worrying about that. I'm starting with the premise that every kid has a gift because I found as an educator over these years that one, when we test kids in first grade and second grade, many of the kids have no idea what test they're taking. They don't care.
Yeah.
And some of the kids whose parents want them to get into the gifted program, they've already been prepping them. So that we're not even comparing apples to apples. We have kids who one of the processes is to create a portfolio at home, bring it in, and have the committee assess it. So what we're doing, Ross, is we're grading the parents
Yeah.
because a kid brings a portfolio in from home in first grade or second grade and third grade, and they have this immaculate portfolio. I'm like, so you could have done some of that, but some of the stuff, parents are buying equipment for them, parents are able to support them. The kid who doesn't have that support at home, the portfolios aren't going to be equal. So we're not grading the
Right.
kids, we're grading the parents, right? And so I'm saying, and in my experience, every kid that I've ever worked with has a strength, a passion, if we can give them those opportunities to find it. And so in my book, at the end of the book, I talk about or I highlight 5 people who have shown strengths in different areas. And one of the people I highlight, his name is Andrew Mallon. Andrew was a student who struggled to read early on. He didn't like school, but he was great with art. He is great with his hands. And his parents realized that early on. So his parents had resources. And so they were able to create a wood shop in their garage. And he loved carpentry. When Andrew got to high school, he was ready to drop out because he just didn't like high school. I mean, he didn't like school, but he did like carpentry. And his parents went to the high school and said, Andrew is really passionate about carpentry. He's worked hard. He's good at it. Can he take the upper level carpentry class because the first level carpentry class he's kind of mastered. And the school said no. The parents came back and said if he doesn't take this class, that's the only thing that's keeping him in school. And so the because his parents were able to advocate for him, and the school finally relented and allowed him to take that upper level carpentry class when he was in ninth grade, or I think ninth or 10th grade. So he stayed in school. He finished school. He connected with the carpentry teacher. The carpentry teacher eventually helped him get a job as a carpenter. Andrew is now a world-class tree sculptor. He
Mm.
goes around the world. He's one of the top 10 in the world of as being a tree sculptor. Like he takes trees and he creates tons of different things out of those trees. But think about if Andrew's parents weren't there to advocate for him to stay in school, to be able to take that upper level course. We should be in our, as educators, we are in loco parentis. Every kid doesn't have the Mr. and Mrs. Mallon to advocate for their Andrew, right? And so every kid doesn't have those parents. So we as educators should be helping our kids find their strengths and pushing the envelope and challenging the status quo. Like if somebody is really good at something, like Andrew was, and we know that's keeping him in school, then why would we not allow him to take that class? So somebody in that school should be able to say, this kid is strong at this or is passionate at this. We need to make sure that we're allowing him to take this class or her to take this class. That's what I'm talking about. We as educators have to start looking ourselves in the mirror and saying, every kid has a gift. Let's find it. Now, if they don't have somebody who advocates for them, we have to be the advocates for them within this system, because if not, then many might drop out or even drop out psychologically in school. They'll just be just going through the motions. So I
Yeah.
think that's what I'm talking about. Every kid has something that they can offer.
Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, that's even more important now almost than ever, given particularly the past few years post pandemic. The chronic absenteeism challenge has gotten even worse. And that's a big thing. Like, there is evidence that schooling coursework that kids really want to be taking, that they feel like is relevant to them, is effective at keeping them in school, keeping them in present and engaged. Like, the absolute necessities, one, to graduate, is one, them being there, right? But then they're actually engaged and learning because they're taking courses they care about, they see the point of it, versus, as you said, either being disengaged or truant and on the path to not graduating, when it's very evident to them, well, what I'm learning here is not really of use to me.
Exactly. And one of the things that I think we are realizing slowly, but through their passions, through what they're interested in, we can teach them literacy. We can teach them numeracy through, but sometimes we're like so stuck on they have to be in this math class, they have to be in this literacy class, which is fine. But sometimes kids will learn it through hands-on, project-based learning, all the things that we can do to help kids. We want them to be able to read. We want them to be able to balance their checkbooks and do things in their lives after school. But sometimes we have to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more flexible in our approach.
So let's talk a little bit about, so every student deserves a gifted education. I think it's, we should define what is a gifted education. I think you've indicated that in some ways, but to the title of this book, to even what some of the quotes that you receive from folks who admitted to, well, when I first heard this, I wasn't totally sure, but now that I've read about it, now that I've seen what Brian did in his schools, right now I get it. But yeah, what do you mean by a gifted education, and like what is the mindset shift that's necessary to basically come to the agreement with the title of this book and with the possibility of this book?
Yeah. So as I said before, my definition of gifted is really looking at every kid and starting with the premise that every kid has a strength. And so I'm really kind of saying that the old model of gifted education, where we're going to test kids and sort and select and rank, that's not what I'm talking about. And like I said, those programs are so entrenched, and a lot of times parents want those, or the loudest parents want those, or the most influential parents want those, that they are entrenched. I'm saying, well, you can keep those programs, but we're still going to do the same things for all kids that we did. And so in my former school, for example, we said that, and I worked for a huge county who had gifted centers for kids in elementary school. And what I had said is, it doesn't matter who the kid is in my school, in our school, we're going to do the same things and give them the same opportunities as those kids who get the quote magic ticket or the lucky star. And so, if we're going to do, for example, Socratic seminar, which is a traditionally gifted kind of a practice, every kid is going to be able to participate in Socratic seminar. And so, but we as the adults have to put more tools in our toolkits to be able to support all kids. to be able to access Socratic seminar. Some kids may not have the language. Some kids may not have the behavior. So we have to pre-teach some of these behaviors. We might have to pre-teach some of the academic vocabulary to students so they can access. We might have to pre-teach some of the academic discourse, how you communicate with each other during Socratic seminar, but we're going to give those opportunities to all kids. And so in my school, and that's why when I talk about every student deserves a gifted education, and I say 5 shifts, there are 5 things that we can
Mhm.
do that the teachers, the educators, the adults in the building can do to really change our culture, change our mindset and our belief system about all kids. One, we have to start to, and the first one is called Fallacy of Fixed Intelligence. We have to start to learn about the science of learning and about the brain and about all the information we have about how all kids can learn at high levels. You know, Carol Dweck talks about this idea of mind growth mindset and that intelligence is not fixed. It's not. We can improve our intelligence. And many of us came up with, oh, he or she has this IQ, or he or she is smart, and this kid is kind of in the middle, and this kid is not. No, kids come to us at different levels, but they can all improve. And so we have to start learning about the brain, the science of the brain. We have to learn about the parts of the brain. And in my chapter 1 of Every Student Deserves a Gifted Education, under the fallacy of fixed intelligence, we learn about the parts of the brain. I teach people about the parts of the brain. I teach them about the chemicals in the brain and how they affect learning. And we as educators have never had, courses on this. When we go through our programs, we don't have course, and it's especially now because it's been really updated and the research has been updated. There is a gentleman named Dr. George Land, and this is from the 1960s. He was commissioned by NASA to find out what makes somebody a genius. And so what he did is he did this study. He did this study where he took 5-year-olds and he was shocked. He took 5-year-olds and did this study. And after the study was over, he actually identified that 98% of the 5-year-olds were creative geniuses. And then he followed them 5 years later. And at 10 years old, he tested them again, and only 30% were still in the category of creative genius. 5 years later, when they were 15, he tested them again. And at that point, only 12% were creative genius. He followed them, and then he tested adults, and only 2%. And he's like, how can 5-year-olds start off as not geniuses, and by the time they get to adults, they're only 2% geniuses? And he said what he attributed that decline to was school, because we are such a factory model. We want conformity, and we don't help kids find their creativity. And so he says school actually dumbs down kids to traditional school. He's like 98% of genius. So that's where I start. 90 all of our kids are geniuses in their own way. So I'm going to start with that premise. I'm not going to worry about a test. I'm going to help you find your passion, your gift. And so that's what we did at Mason Crest. So first, we as a staff, we said we have to really study mindset. We have to study the brain so we can start to dispel some of these myths about intelligence. The second thing is, and it's pernicious in our cultures in our school, is this idea of labels. That's my second shift. We got to get rid of these labels. And it's called Labels Be Gone. That's my second chapter. Because when we label kids, we teach to that label. And it's killing us. So
Mhm.
labels like special ed, there are no special ed students. There are general ed students who receive special ed services. Our kids receive services. Kids are not barcoded. And so, but when we label kids low or medium or high, or they're from this side of the town or whatever, then psychologically we lower our expectations. So we really started to watch our language about labeling. And there's ample research on labeling and how it lowers our expectations for kids. And so that's a chapter in itself. It's really making sure that we work on not labeling kids, even down to their name. We have in my former school, we had like 35 or 36 birth countries, 40 some languages, and kids come from all over and they have different names. But when we start, because some kids' names are difficult to pronounce, But when we start giving kids nicknames or just giving their first name because we have a hard time pronouncing it, that's in a sense labeling them. And it actually changes our expectations and it also changes our relationships because if you can't pronounce a kid, that's central to who they are. And
Yeah.
if you can't pronounce a kid's name, then they're like, how can I learn from this person? Why should I care? And so that's just part of it. But we label kids by the way we group them. If we have a paraprofessional always working with certain kids when they come into the classroom, that's a way of labeling. So we have to really think about this idea of, are we barcoding kids? Are we giving them a scarlet letter and changing our expectations because of that label? So that's chapter two. Chapter three is this idea of obligation of teams. And this is probably the most difficult piece because obligation of teams is about how do we take collective responsibility for every single child. It's not just about one teacher, it's about the teachers on that team saying these are all of our kids. It's not your kid or my kid, these are all of our kids. And how do we use our collective knowledge, skills, wisdom, experience to make sure that every child gets across the finish line? And so my that chapter is about just how teams create norms, how teams work together. And I have stories about, I have sports stories on how teams really are vulnerable and how individuals on the teams will share that they're not good at this in this area, but their teammate would pick up the slack. We have to be able to do that in education. We have to be able to be vulnerable and say, Ross, in this area, it doesn't seem like I'm very effective. Can I come and watch you teach this skill or this standard so I can get more, I can become more effective? Looking at the data, the students that you're working with, Ross, got 85% or 90% on this skill. The students that I'm working with on the same grade level got 40%. I'm not going to look at myself as a bad teacher. I'm going to say, I'm not effective in this area yet. Can I learn from my colleagues? And it's your responsibility, Ross, to say, yeah, come on in, because these are all of our kids. If we go back to the days of Ross, you're a fourth grade teacher, I'm a fourth grade teacher, and we have two other fourth grade teachers on the team, and each teacher does their own thing in isolation, they never talk, then it's an educational lottery. It depends on what kid gets the teacher who might be able to go or is willing to go above and beyond. That kid is lucky. But if we pool our resources and say these are all of our kids and we're going to share all of our knowledge and our skills, then every kid benefits. So I think that's
Yeah.
important. That piece is huge. So that's
And
the obligation of teams.
I want to stop on that, and we'll get to the last two, but I want to stop on those last couple to reinforce it for the listeners to make sure that they're really thinking about it. And one of the things that I like to do sometimes when having this conversation is I call it like introducing a little bit of that friction to say, okay, when we're talking about these, and they sound probably to most listeners like, okay, this sounds good. Like, but to stop on, okay, well, it sounds good, right? But it's not happening all the time. So there's something that is preventing it. There's something that's making it challenging. One thing also I do want to note that you helped me learn today is, actually this podcast recently, thanks to our listeners, we have attained or reached the top 3% of global podcasts. But you actually shared that you and I are in the top 2% because anybody listening knows that we are creative geniuses, right? If they're, but more importantly, kind of, I mean, these first three, like fallacy, fixed intelligence, labels be gone, obligation of teams, they're interconnected in an important way. And especially it relates to the labels and it relates to the culture around how we name things, how we label, how we think about it, and doing that authentically, right? And it might feel hard at first. Sometimes it might just feel like semantics or, well, or euphemisms, right? Okay, we're instead of saying a kid is X, they're special education, we're going to say something else, or, but the reality is there's a culture around that, right? That once we start doing it, then it
Yeah.
changes the way we think about them. I'm not going to be able to cite
The
my
way you
source.
think, the way you act, it changes the way you do business.
Right. Well, I'm not going to be able to cite my source on this, whether it was a study, but there was a related thing that I had read, and I don't know, but it was around how your thoughts affect your actions, but also vice versa. And the, specific example was around spouses and the way they felt toward each other. And so spouses that went to marriage counseling and said, well, I just don't really feel like I love my spouse that much anymore, or whatever. And they were challenged to say, okay, here's what your task is every day. You need to tell your spouse you love them, right? And then over time, they report they started to feel that again. I mean, I feel like the same thing here. Like once you're in the habit and used to thinking about kids' strengths and their assets and talking about them in that way, it also changes the way you think about them. And eventually, it never occurs to you to use those types of negative labels
Yeah.
because your whole mindset has shifted. So while at first I think for some people it's just like fine, we'll do this or we won't use those labels, but we know what we really mean. When you have a culture around it and when you're in the practice of it, it really does make you focus more on the strengths.
Yeah, and so and the other thing is, I just don't say this. I use research. I use evidence. So John Hattie talks about, and he has this huge database of research, and he calls it visible learning. And he has identified practices that work. And one of the things that John Hattie did is, he has maybe 230, maybe 240 practices that work for student achievement. Some work better than others. And what he has found that in his study is, and he uses effect sizes. And one of the things, I don't
Mhm.
want to get too technical, but one of the things he finds is that the average teacher for the average student improves a student's learning, or for any student, improves student learning 0.30. And he said just by being alive, a student learned something. So they improved 0.10. So together in a school year, a student, improves 0.40 in the average teacher's classroom. And this is
Mhm.
like a huge study. I mean, thousands of studies and millions of kids. And so when he looks at labeling, because labeling is one of the effect size, one of the practices, he says that not labeling kids is higher than the average teacher in the average year. So look,
Mhm.
the average teacher is 0.40. Not labeling kids gives you an effect size of 0.60. And so some of the research, and that's what we have to do is as educators, we have to look at some of the research and the evidence. And so it's not just saying we shouldn't label them. We know that we should not label kids. But when you
Yeah.
start to look at some of the research and the evidence, it's like, okay, one of the things I do in the back of my book, Ross, is I talk about resistance because in education we have so many different initiatives, and to be honest, educators can get jaded. We have initiatives all the time. But one of my colleagues and good friends, or two of them, Luis Cruz and Anthony Muhammad, they wrote a book called Time for Change. And before that, Anthony Muhammad wrote a book entitled Transforming School Culture. And he talks about why people resist change. And that's what we did in our schools also, is use some of these tools. People resist change because one, they don't know how. Like we have all these initiatives and we say, okay, you just do this, and people resist. They're like, well, we haven't had the training. We haven't had the time, training, support to do what you're asking us to do. So people resist. So we start by, with this part, is by building shared knowledge, learning together, sharing the evidence. People also resist because they don't know why. Again, we've had so many initiatives. We're like, why should we change? If we get a new principal, they might change the initiative or they might
Mhm.
change.
Yep.
So people have to really understand why. People also resist because they don't trust the leaders. And so in our building, in my building, as a administrator, we always said that the administrators were the lead mistake makers. We're going to make as many mistakes as you all. And so we want to model that it's okay for you all to be creative, for you all to make mistakes. As we're learning, we're going to make mistakes. That's part of the growth mindset. And so if we're helping people with the how, giving them the proper time, training, and support to do what we're asking them to do. We're helping them with the rationale, the why. We're actually helping them with the trust piece because we want people to work together and to be transparent because we want to model for teachers what we want teachers to model for kids. If we're
Mhm.
saying we want to have a building where we really support the growth mindset is part of it is being okay with making mistakes and taking risk. and being persistent. And so we want teachers to be able to make mistakes. We don't want anybody to be perfect. We just want progress. And so those three things, if we can do those three things, then we can help people move forward with learning about the brain and intelligence, learning about why it's important for us to get rid of these negative labels, why it's important for us to work as teams because we have together we're much stronger than individually. And so those three pieces actually set the soil or the soil, the fertile soil for
Yeah.
the next two parts. The next two parts are superpowers and resistance and inspiration. The first three chapters are like the soil. The second two chapters, the last two chapters are like the seed. And if we don't get the first three chapters right, then it doesn't matter what programs, what we do, it's not gonna take because we
Yeah.
have to have our culture, our soil right to be able to plant the seeds.
Yeah. So tell us about those last two chapters, and then one of which also was the foundation of your second book.
Yeah, so our superpowers, I have two different sections. The first section is a section of seven superpowers that I talk about teachers really need to embrace. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of them is starting with strengths. And you had talked about this before. So if we start with strengths, we just start with the premise that kids have strengths and that we start to identify, cultivate, nurture their strengths, then a lot of things will take care of themselves. If a kid is always coming to remediation all the time and nobody ever tells him or her the kids that they have strengths, then all they're going to think is, I don't have any strengths. So one of them is start with strengths. The other one is there's another one about relationships. We have to make sure that we are truly building relationships and knowing kids kind of foundation, where they're coming from, their lived experiences. We have to truly know kids' lived experiences, not to lower expectations, but to have context. If I have a kid coming from a certain situation, then I can be able to plan accordingly. Again, it's not to lower expectations. I'm not, oh, woe is that kid. It's okay. My eye is on the kid and what they're bringing to the table. And my other eye is on where am I going to take them, grade level or better, and helping them find their passions. And so, again, I have seven superpowers for teachers, and then I have seven superpowers for students. And that's what formed my second book, Limitless Future. So the seven superpowers for students are really attitudes, beliefs, behaviors that will take them beyond the academic world. Persistence, that's one of them. Everything that you do in this life you need to be able to keep going and persist and to be successful. Precise communications is one of them. How do we communicate verbally, orally, in writing? Are we able to communicate our thoughts in order for us to make sure we're getting our point across? Self-control, self-discipline. That's something again that's going to serve us well beyond the pre-K 12 system. It will serve us in any area of life that we go to. Curiosity. We have to make sure that we're helping in modeling curiosity and helping kids become more thoughtful about the world and have them just really think about anything that they want is possible, but they have to believe that, and we have to kind of model that curiosity is okay. Like they can think about anything that anything is possible. And when we say be curious and ask questions and challenge, that's important. One of them is empathy. Empathy is a huge skill in building relationships and being able to understand others. The last two are flexible thinking and being able to change directions, and also critical thinking critically is looking at something and being able to sift through what's real and what's not real, but also being able to pivot when I get new information. If it challenges something that I thought was true but it's not true any longer or it's not relevant any longer, I should be able to pivot and say, okay, now this is something I believe in. And the last one is optimism. When things are tough and challenging in sports, in life, in school, in any area, as we go through this journey, then how do we keep an optimistic spirit? So those seven superpowers for students, I have teachers teach, but I also had some questions as I wrote this book. on social media. I had parents say, Brian, we read this book and we love those superpowers for students. And I call them seven essential attributes. And so some parents said, well, why don't you write a book for parents? Because those attributes parents could be modeling, teaching, and reinforcing at home. And one of the things I kind of grappled with at first, I'm like, well, I can't, force parents to read this. I mean, all parents won't read this. But one of the things I really believe is I can't make parents do anything, but I can influence. And so this book is to help influence parents who get the book to teach, model, reinforce those seven essential attributes. And at the beginning of the book, I talk about how my own parents, Paul and Doris Butler, taught, modeled, and reinforced those very seven essential attributes, although they didn't really call them that at the time. I think back now, and that's what they did. And whenever I go in life, I pull on those skills, on those behaviors to move through and to be successful. And so that's what Limitless Future is about. But I really start off Limitless Future with that story of George Land, who I told you about earlier, the researcher who NASA hired to to do a study on what makes a genius, because I wanted parents to understand your child's a genius. We just have to figure out where the genius at. So I think that's kind of where the Limitless Future came out of, just the genesis of parents who are educators asking about, would I write a book for just those seven essential attributes for students or kids?
Yeah. Yeah, and those the skills stand out, as being really nicely in alignment with, what currently is often called durable skills, or
Yeah,
and relates over the course of time by many different life skills, social emotional
exactly.
learning, whatever the name, but that these are skills that are the essential skills aligned to in-demand fields, to workforce readiness, to life success, right? And going back to what you talked about earlier, and to George Land and the study and the that factory model, or that how school was kind of educating that out of kids a lot of time, that much of the reason probably why that those things were deprioritized, or why it still was a struggle, or it still is today in a lot of places, to say like these are what kids need to be learning, is because if people just, I guess, didn't know how to teach them, right, or
Yeah,
felt like they couldn't be learned, like they were just intrinsic. And some kids have this, some kids are creative, some kids aren't, some kids are curious, and but in fact, especially in how rapidly evolving the world is, and how the jobs of the future are going to be totally different than what we even know about today, these type of skills and persistence and being able to learn about learning, right? The curiosity to learn new things, communicate, be adaptable, flexible, that is the best thing that you can learn. There's a subject matter knowledge, there's other things, but we can't necessarily know how kids will have to apply all those things in the future, or exactly what they're going to be doing. We can anticipate, I think, with a high degree of certainty, that they will do more than one thing over the course of their life. They will have multiple careers. They will change course a number of times, and in order to do that, they need these skills.
Well, and you're exactly right. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is some of these skills, some of our kids come with because they've been modeled for the first 5 years of their life. And so when it's time for them to take an assessment to go into the gifted program, they are persisting. They have self-control. But some of the kids don't have those attributes yet because they haven't been modeled or taught on a consistent basis. And so we say this kid is gifted and this kid can't sit still. That's so we're not comparing apples to apples. And so we really have to again rethink how we view kids. As you know, after 36, 37 years, I truly believe that we rank, sort, and select and grade the home. We're not grading the kids, we're grading the home. And I have to be honest, because when my kids needed something, a project, my wife and I would go out and buy things for them, and they would get help at home. One of the things that we did in my former school is we got rid of homework in elementary school, and we looked at the research. And what is homework supposed to be? It's supposed to reinforce the learning that was taught during that day. So if it's just supposed to reinforce learning and a kid goes home, they go home to a computer, to parents that read to them, to parents that are going to support them with their homework, then that's great. But if we have another student who goes home because their parents are working two, three jobs. They go home with other siblings who are not, or they're there, but they're not going to reinforce their homework. Then they come back in, and one student has his or her homework done, and the other student doesn't. And then we are penalizing the student. So what we
Mhm.
said is, how can we actually make sure that we are reinforcing what we teach during the day? And so we created what we call a workshop model where the teacher teaches a lesson. He or she works with small groups of students to reinforce that lesson, and they kind of circle through that teacher. And if a teacher sees that a student didn't get something, then they're going to actually work on reinforcing that standard, that lesson, what that skill that they taught right there, and have that student practice right there in the classroom so they don't have to go home. One, it
Mhm.
takes the pressure off of home because parents are going crazy anyway with all the things that they have to do. So we're like, let's get rid of it. Plus, we know in elementary school from the research, and it's in John Hattie's research, homework is like, it's like a point 0.1 effect size. So it doesn't really matter in elementary school. And so like, take that off the plate. If we can reinforce what we taught during the school day that access homework. And that's what we did in our school. But we had to learn together. We had to learn about the research. We actually brought parents in to learn with us because, we can't just say no homework because parents will be like, well, what do we do now? Because sometimes parents use homework because they do it because it was done to them. So we brought parents into our learning together so they can spread the word about, okay, this is what the research says, and this is how they're going to reinforce what they taught during the day so kids don't need to do homework. So we have to make sure that we're one, involving the community, involving the parents. We did the same thing with growth mindset when we started studying about the brain. We invited parents. We had like a 5 session book talk as a staff, and we invited just parents who wanted to be a part of that book talk. And some parents came, and I had parents write testimonials in Every Student Deserves a Gifted Education about how enlightening learning about growth mindset and fixed mindset from Carol Dweck's work. Because again, parents only know what they know, and they only kind of respond to how they were taught and the schooling that they went through, right?
Mhm.
So we have to start to, one, as a school system or as a profession, open our and be a little bit vulnerable and open our trainings up to some of our parents. So parents are like, oh, this is what they mean. Sometimes we just do stuff and parents are like, either we'll follow what you did or they push back because they're like, this is not the way it was done for me. And we can't continue to do schooling the way that was done to us because we're not preparing kids for our past. We're
Mhm.
preparing them for their futures, and we can't use a lot of the things that we did in our past to prepare kids for their futures.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brian, you also have a podcast, A Conversation with Brian.
I do.
Before we wrap up here, wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that and what it's about and what listeners might expect if they check it out.
Sure. Before I do that, I just want to say at the end of Every Student Deserves a Gifted Education, I talked a little bit about it when I shared about Andrew Mallon, but
Mhm.
it's the last section is called Resistance and Inspiration. I talked a little bit about the resistance, why people resist, but the inspiration piece is a lot of times people will say, well, this sounds great, but how do we do it? And so I highlight 5 school districts in chapter 5 that are doing great things on gifted education for all, on the growth mindset teachings, on just making sure that all kids have access to opportunities. And so I highlight 5 school districts from around the country. And also, I highlight 5 people who have really benefited from some of the essential attributes that I talk about for students. Again, one is Andrew Mallon. So, again, I wanted to make sure that people think Brian writes a book. Well, what does this look like? And where can I see it in action? So, those are 5 school districts from around the country, and then 5 people who I highlighted. My podcast is just a podcast, kind of like yours, Ross. It's really just to talk to educators. I talk to other people, but primarily educators, and because I want to highlight the great things that are happening. I think we talked about this early on, maybe before we came on, but we have to start shouting to the world what we do as educators. There are so many things that happen in our schools, in our districts. There are great things that are happening. A lot of things that are very exciting. and people need to know about it. Educators are kind of modest, and I want to just shine a light on a lot of the great things that are happening in our country. As I said before, you can have a school where the test scores don't look real great, but you have some kids who are coming in for whatever reason, two, three grade levels behind into the to that year, and they improved two grade levels with our internal data, but they didn't get to that. They didn't improve three grade levels to be able to pass the state tests. But improving two grade levels in 1 year is huge.
Mhm.
But the general public doesn't hear that. So we have to start shouting to the world all the stuff that we do that is great. Now, do we have some challenges and things that we need to look in the mirror and say we need to change some things and really start to ramp up some of our practices and some of our learning? Yeah. But my podcast is to highlight some of the people who are just doing some great things, not just in our country, around the world. I've had people from Australia and others on to share because we have similar challenges around the world with education. But I just want to highlight people who are doing some good things, and many of them written books, many of them written a number of articles, have been celebrated. Some of the same people who have you've had on, but I just want people to know that we're going to start shouting and becoming going on the offensive with some of the things that are happening in our profession because there are great people who are doing a lot of good things for students, and we just need to tell people what we're doing and be transparent about it.
Yeah. And you end every podcast with, as I go, I am wearing you. But tell our listeners about that as well.
I use that at my dad's funeral. One of the things that I say is there is no self-made person on this planet. I do not like that term because everybody has help. Nobody can tell me that they just were successful on their own. And so I use this old African proverb that my wife shared with me a long time ago, but I use it at my dad's funeral because it's a proverb that really, as I go, I am wearing you. It just talks about all the people who have helped me be successful. When you hear Brian Butler, or you see Brian Butler and all the books that I've written for books, contributed author, solo author, being in the profession for 36 years, it's not because of Brian Butler. There are hundreds of people who have poured into me. I wear my grandparents. Unfortunately, I never met my grandfather. He died before I was born. But I am wearing him. I'm wearing my grandmother, my grandparents on my mom's side, my parents, all the coaches and teachers and educators who poured into me, the people who, saw something in me to be an educator. Everybody who has helped me along the way, I am wearing. And so as you see me, you're seeing hundreds of people who I represent. And I think that's the case for many people who are wearing others who have supported them along the way. Me being successful, as I said, I was born in the right family, and then I had a lot of people help me. Now, I worked hard. I'm not going to say that. I've tried to treat people well. I've tried to cultivate relationships, but all those things were modeled for me as well. Right. And
Mhm.
so I'm not going to sit here and say I'm some superstar and it was all me, being successful. No, you're seeing a combination of so many people who have helped me along the way. And so as I go, I am wearing them, and that's kind of where I get it from.
Yeah. Well, that really resonates, and even I think came up in ways both explicit and subtle in this very conversation. You're, I think, much better at citing your sources and remembering where you learn things. But as we have these conversations and do these episodes, right, and or listen to them, right, there's things that you pick up on and wisdom that's shared and ideas, and it all goes in there somewhere, right? And it benefits us. And yeah, as you go through our lives and our successes, our failures, and none of it is done alone. It's all shared. So I think it's a great way to tie this all together. And listeners will put the links below where you can learn more about Brian and his books. Anything else on your website besides the books, the podcast, anything else listeners should check out?
No, I mean, if they check out my website, they'll find a lot of information, and I think that's about it. I think, the last thing I just like to say is, and this is tied into this idea that every kid has a gift. Oliver Wendell Holmes had this quote, many people die with their music still in them. We don't want people to die with their gifts still in them when they haven't shared them to the world. I say, what is a gift? A gift is something that we give to others, right? And it makes us feel good. Every kid should have something that they can give to the world that makes them feel good. I don't want kids to die with their music still in them, with their gifts still in them.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Brian, for being here. Thanks to the listeners. Again, we'll put the link below to Brian's website where you can learn more about all of this. Please do also subscribe to The Authority if you're not already to hear more of our conversations upcoming, or go back and check out some of our older ones if you haven't heard them yet, or you just want to hear them again. But we will continue to bring you valuable conversations like this with great guests every week. Brian, thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.
This episode was edited by Gage Sanderson.